We got another perception on that maybe it's not all this anatomy and sort of the normal psychoanalytical idea. It could be a completely new way of looking at it. But in order to see it that way, the body now becomes, the idea of the body being sacred factors in, a huge piece. But then this thing that I bring to the plate, which is, bring to the table, antipathy to nature, which is antipathy to the self, a major root of pathology, and the root of the cocktail of so many disorders. After you create the ego, then you have the ubiquitous collectivism and extroversion, your need now to run amok, overly so, to receive approval from those who are seeking it from you. And this whole entanglement and enthralldom. And the neurosis and anxiety that arises when that's not forthcoming. What we become when we are not receiving it. One of the symptoms of that is the intense self-hate, right? Whatever you want to call it, shame, guilt, masochism, self-murder, it really doesn't matter. And ultimately then, this avoidance of legitimate suffering, legitimate anxiety, which is tantamount to disowning the self. Throwing into the wilderness of the dark places of the interior the very imperial voice that we need to be listening to and taking guidance from. Now, we mentioned the moral superiority of the authentic man, because that virtue, that morality, is very, very important. But we still need to work more towards the last hour here of how to unlock the doors to true freedom. More deeply, more real. And to do that, to really basically strike the master blow, if you will, at the roots of evil, it requires the cultivation of what I describe as the virtue of virtues. And the backstory is borrowed from the existential psychology and the existential philosophy, because the virtue of virtues is the value of existence. Now, I know it doesn't sound very much yet. It's very, very much strong in the existential philosophical tradition. They often refer to it as being unto death. I know that sounds morbid, but give me a minute. It's a fundamental principle of existentialist philosophy. Because, as we said before, your understanding that your life is finite should theoretically give impact and importance to your life. We'll unpack it more in a minute. But lack of this virtue, meaning lack of the value for your existence, is at the root of all the human problems and dilemmas. And we're going to explore this towards the end and get into the children, falls under this category, right? The man with this virtue is morally superior, the one who values existence. He's a true individual. He alone is capable of bringing meaning from within himself, as opposed to waiting for everyone else in the world to turn him on. He doesn't have a slave below him or a master above. He's very vigilant on that point. And his relationship with pain, with loss, and with death is radically different than everybody else around him, because he is very much infused with that value of existence, the virtue of virtues. And this man also works with the will to power. But the fact that he is a man of the will to power, he turns out to be the single greatest threat to the collectivists. They want to obliterate him. He's in their crosshairs. Because he actually stands up to ruin everything. Their whole Bastille of lies, he sees, can crumble through his existence. Now, in the Gospel of Thomas, Jesus said, if you have gained this within you, what you have will save you. If you do not have this within you, what you do not have in you will kill you. And this is often phrased slightly differently. What the basic message is you have to bring out from within that meaning. You have to bring out from within yourself what we've talked about earlier. Otherwise, there's no salvation. But the existentially mutilated and vacant being, he's Big Brother's wet dream. He's exactly what they've created. And they know that in his mind, this whole cocktail of syndromes, he is heading straight for self-destruction. And at the point, right, at the very point where he's about to commit suicide, and I'm talking psychologically here, they come in with their global village and say, here's the ticket, and we go for it. So talking today, sitting drinking coffee, It doesn't seem like a reality, does it? But as this process continues, and in the very short future, to offset complete collapse, they move in with their stabilizers. This is how it's done first. And the slow drip feeding of their trauma is all part of it. They know that the man that they're working with is incapable of bringing meaning from within. He's nothing more than a papier-mâché creature screaming about oneness without even the faintest idea of what it is. Talk about allness, yeah, I'm with you. Oneness, I don't understand it. Now, Rollo May, speaking about Nietzsche, says that being is a category which cannot be reduced to the interjection of social and ethical norms. It is, to use Nietzsche's phrase, beyond good and evil. Remember we talked about this one in the beginning? To the extent that my sense of existence is authentic, it is precisely not what others have told me I should be, but is the one Archimedes point I have to stand on from which to judge what parents and other authorities demand. Rand says that a genuine selfishness, that is, a genuine concern with discovering what is to one's own self-interest and acceptance of the responsibility of achieving it, a refusal to ever betray it by acting on blind whim, mood, impulse, or feeling of the moment, an uncompromising loyalty to one's judgment, convictions, and values represents a profound moral achievement. And as Crowley said, how will a being like that ever even conceive of hurting anyone else? Now, match that with the amount of time we give in our minds to everybody else. Viktor Frankl, a very great psychologist, said that everything can be taken from man but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. And that alignment with your selfhood that we spoke about is an act to and for the self. Now, writer E.E. Cummings said that to be nobody but yourself in a world which is doing its best night and day to make you like everybody else means to fight the hardest battle which any human being can fight and never stop fighting. That is the real war of Armageddon that has been asked of a lot of people today. The French philosopher Henry Bergson, who had a great deal to say on the question of time, he says liberty consists in being entirely oneself. That's it. There is no other freedom. Mikhail Buchanan, who said, the liberty of man consists solely in this, that he obeys the law of nature, see? Because he himself recognized them as such, and not because they've been imposed upon him externally by any foreign will whatsoever, human or divine, collective or individual. Liberty, he says, consists in my being entitled as a man to obey no other man and to act only on my own judgment. Now look how simple and direct that is, and yet look how foreign it is to these collectivists. He says, liberty is the absolute right of all adult men and women to seek no sanction for their actions except their own conscience and their own reason, to determine them only of their own free will, and consequently to be responsible for them, to themselves first of all, and then to society of which they are a part, but only insofar as they freely consent to be part of it. So we are moving towards the antithesis of this every day. But Gruen says we want to escape responsibility because we are deeply afraid of having a self of our own. And we were raised by people who have antipathy to that. In fact, we may have been given birth as crutches to their obsess. It is not an abstract responsibility that we find threatening, but rather the responsibility to realize ourselves. We've all tried it and failed because of this imposition. What is he talking about? He's saying that man will do anything than walk the Siddhartha road. He tries it, he doesn't like it. Anything but the shadow work. But it's worse than that. No, he'll not just do anything. He will literally permit the worst tyrannies to arise in the world just because it covers the crime that he's doing for himself. It's the bric-a-brac that hides the china. I blame them. Finger pointing. Because in that mayhem of these disastrous vultures up there, their crime covers the other crime that we do to ourselves when we're avoiding this holy work. Right? This is what the dynamic is. Rather than walk the Siddhartha road, rather than face ourselves, we'd see the world and other people thrown into the dumpsters, incarcerated, made mindless. Now we've seen something about the inner state of man and his penchant for this evasion. Now we can now continue on our research into his criminal history. We can intensify that by bringing children into the picture. I've often said that anger and violence are not the world's problem, but it's false love is the problem. There's that word, adultism. And we came up very clearly there. Osho the mystic said, everybody is living in bondage because everybody who brought you up wanted to have power over you, to enjoy the mastery over you. And children are the most helpless people in the world, the most exploited class. It is not the proletariat who are the most exploited class. It is not the women who are the most exploited class. It is the children who are the most exploited class. And Robert Bly, who wrote Iron John, he says the possessiveness that mothers typically exercise on sons, not to mention the possessiveness that fathers typically exercise on daughters, can never be underestimated. Think I'm joking? When it comes to kids, we've already spoken a little bit about the aesthetic sensibility. Once the child is born, I mean, they already have this, but we need to take the kids out into their world. We need to introduce the child to nature very quickly, not recreationally, but spiritually. We've spoken about doing it ourselves, and this is absolutely critical in the life and development of a child. Take him to the ocean, take him to the forests, take him to every conceivable kind of animal, take them out in the seasons and so on. And remember we said that historically there was a moment when that aesthetic sense awoken in our forefather, and that it can also individually happen in the life of a stereotypical person. We want to be there when it happens in the child, because it will. And we can caretake it if we do it right. Not through any kind of paranoia or fear or stress. None of that is required. But children should be taken out of the cities often and exposed to nature in all nature's sides. Draw their attention to the negative way that nature is then often portrayed in the movies, especially in horror movies and so on, so that they'll see, they'll fall in love with nature, and then they'll start to see, what the fuck is all this? Well, owls and black cats, and wolves, and as kids are brought up today to fear, a little bit of wind in the trees, thanks to our lovely media, and the moon and all of the rest of it. Also explain to them that every single thing around them, even the plastic, comes from nature. There's not a thing that we eat, a thing that we use, that nature is not the originator of. Really rub that in. Introduce them to animals. Many reasons for this, many reasons. There's also a reason why animals surround them anyway, why they like dinosaurs and wallpapers with animals on it, teddy bears. There's a reason for that. It's because they're back here, remember? They're back here at that ancestral place. That's why they like all those dolls and toys and all around them. Good. And bring them real animals as well. But do that, again emphasize, without coercion, without censorship. Because you're actually observing what comes out of them naturally. We're going to get into that in a minute. Certainly some kids are slower at the uptake. Give them time then. Nothing wrong with being slow. Because again, those kids who are fighting you are doing right half the time, you see. Rebellion is good. Crime is not good. Breaking the world's laws is not good. But rebellion is a good thing. Take them out. Show them the different seasons. Nature has more than one season. Nature does a lot of different things. They will understand that this is not separate to me. We're born from the womb of this. We come from this. Ultimately, again, borrowing from the existentialists, don't make it just that their relationships are with other people. Wake them up to the brick walls, the tiles, the rusted lampposts, the apples, the flowers, the paving stones, the inanimate, the pianos and the guitars. There's a whole universe of so-called inanimate things We can't have love with them. We can't enter into love with a pane of glass on a window, or the way the light, shines off a roof. That's all. We're just anonymous, just something that just happens all around us in the umfeld. Turn the children on to that. Make them conscious and aware of it so they have many friends, many thousands of friends. Hence, they won't be so dependent on the lost and the misguided. And in fact, they'll be able to help their fellows in the world. Because what will happen after a little bit of this is done? In a very, very short time, the child will come back and view man's world, and to see it for the obscenity that it largely is. You don't need to do very much. The consciousness within the child is doing it all. Also, try not to censor their emotions and natural responses, even if those are angry and so on. Because it is better to have a rude and hostile kid than a bloody compliant nincompoop, an ignoramus. Both are bad, but I can tell you one's worse than the other. And the inanimate includes what their bodies can do, instruments, what the body can do. Introduce them to the power and the brilliance of their own bodies. Clarissa Pinkola Estes, in her book, The Dangerous Old Woman, she says, she's the woman who wrote Women Who Run with the Wolves, she says, some people mistake being loving for being a sap. Quite the contrary. The most loving people are often the most fierce and the most acutely armed for battle, for they care about preserving and protecting poetry, symphonic song, ideas and elements, creatures, inventions, hopes and dreams, dances and holiness, those goodly endeavors that cannot be allowed to perish from the earth, else humanity itself would perish. As I said, to do so is ultimately to commit violence to that soul. They are working from this totality of intelligence already before it's shut off and stamped out of existence. Their centers of intelligence are usually wide open. But look, we're drugging the hell out of them now. Lang says, without the most thorough and rapid brainwashing, their minds would see through our dirty tricks. Children are not yet fools, but we shall turn them into imbeciles like ourselves with high IQs if possible. Specifically, this devastation is largely the work of violence that has been perpetrated on each of us, by each of us on ourselves. And the usual name that much of this violence goes under is love. All that we are talking about, all of us have experienced. You are that child. Everybody sitting in the room would not be here today unless you are that very child we're talking about, that's been so sidetracked and cheated and violated. We've been trained by experts. Then they wonder why, at pubescent times, they're running amok. Coming down a step into a more practical area of children and their development, one that I've always insisted is an absolute death blow to evil, based on one of the foibles of evil itself. I don't know how many times I've said it, must have gone blue in the face, talking about this thing, the Achilles heel of evil, right? I describe it as that evil contains within it the seeds of its own destruction. Hands up how many people have ever heard me say that. Good, because we'll go into that now. Evil is ultimately weak. And it doesn't take much to take it down. And it also doesn't even require a lot of years. You probably could do it in a generation or two, which is a very short time. But it relies on one thing, and that is discernment. And the discernment is born out of a knowledge of this foible of evil that it does contain within itself the seeds of its own destruction. We don't need to fight it from outside. And that is that evil, by definition, cannot exist without what? Huh? No. Camouflage. A mask. If evil appeared in front of us, it wouldn't stand much chance most of the time. 9 times out of 10, we deal with it, right? Evil has a weakness. It must do what? Yes, conceal itself behind a veil of goodness. We'll be getting into this in another context in psychic vampirism, but let's just stick with this from now. In other words, it's the famous idea of the wolf in sheep's clothing. But guess what? There's good news. if you can tell the difference between a fucking sheep and a wolf. You might be onto something. It's that simple. It's that simple. You have to have the discernment to tell the sheep from the wolf. The wolf is shit out of luck and is starved to death. That is called discernment. Once it's taught to a child, they already have it until we mutilate it. Children will speak right up to an adult and go, "Mommy, I don't like him." "What, you're meant to like him? Put that smile on. How dare you be so rude?" The doctor will come up. One kid will allow a nurse or a doctor to touch him, and another guy will come in and go, "No, Mommy, I don't want him. I don't want him near me," like that. We silence it. There it is. And we shut it up. We tell them no. We've got to stop that. They are the ones who have the monitor, the antenna. They bloody smell evil a mile away. How can they not? They're the purest things we breed on this planet. Just like animals do. Right? You can't go near a crow, not more than 6 feet, but a crow will sit on a horse's head. Perch right there. Wonder why. You can smell us coming. And so, if we start, not, as I said, let's not say teaching, helping the discernment, allowing it to flourish, strengthening it, in fact, we have a generation, in one generation of kids, that are immune to evil. And that 100, just like Frank Herbert showed in The Dune, 10 can train 100, 100 can train 1,000, and 1,000, 10,000. And evil is shit out of luck. It has to pack up its bags and go because it has one foible. Think about it when you go home. Evil cannot exist openly. It always is in disguise. And that is its weakness. Because the moment that you have discernment to tell it, and we don't have it to teach it, unfortunately. We're too few to know it. We've already had it killed inside ourselves, as we talked about a few minutes ago. But the child incoming has it. And we need to cultivate that, because that is the death blow. That is the Emmanuel who will be born to bring down the tyrant. And then, again, attendant to this, is that a child grows well when they're introduced to those philosophical certainties that we've been exploring all through this evening. When they're introduced to it, children are born, they're introduced to life. But what's missing? What is the one thing that we rarely ever bring our children and allow them to confront? Death. Even when it happens. I've heard the most preposterous shit. Ireland, all there is weddings and funerals. Been to enough of them. And the kid is fascinated. It's not any kind of paranoid or morbid whatever. It is when it's sensing that the adult's energy, then it gets bent out of shape. But the child is full of fascination. The poet Rainer Maria Rilke said, a true poet cannot write a single line of poetry until it's sat for 10 minutes in a room with a corpse. He was alluding to this. He was saying, why do we debar this fact of life? Children are introduced to life, why not death? Children should be taken to funerals. Not in any kind of morbid way, not in any paranoid way. When death happens in the family, or death happens around, as it often does, death of a pet, death of a grandparent, death on TV, or whatever it might be, or the question of death arises, that child, I wouldn't say put their head in it, but just almost as much. They're fascinated anyway by it. Decay and all of that stuff. It's not morbid. And it's extremely important that they are. Why? We've just talked about something, the virtue of virtues, the value of existence. And the sooner that it is installed in the child, the better. And it can't be installed until they are shocked themselves by death. And the fact that their life does not go on forever. Granny died. Granda died. Where did they go? Well, they just went on a little trip. They're with God now. We do talk a lot about it. But we're not really talking about it. The child has questions. It's right for that child to have questions. You know why it's got questions? Because its vitality is open, its inner eye is open, its questioning is going, it's curious. And we just put corks in that thing. Introducing the child to death in a very clever, philosophical way, and listening to the development and going where that goes, is to awaken in the child, without your effort, it will awaken in it the value of its existence, the virtue of virtues. instantaneously, two things are going to happen. Because there are two kinds of children in the world, as we know. Now, Jacob Boehm said that he who dies not before he dies is ruined when he dies. A great Hermeticist and thinker. Very powerful words there. Once you raise the child in the certainties of life, which is the most important one, is that you are alive and you will die, and nothing on earth, and no Craig Venter, is ever going to change this fact, they will realize that, in other words, if they're to build a solid future, it is your job to teach them these certainties. That's love in a real sense. More than that, they would like to know that you want to teach them it. That you yourself are interested in this. That's the real relationship. They want to know that you know. Because the certainties are many. But we did not create ourselves, nor did we create the universe, and we don't know what happened before the universe got created. Certainties. We're not ready-made beings, because we don't just come into the world packaged and static, and that's it. Like a robot, an action man. We start as one thing, and we go through these rites of passages and end up as something else. We mature biologically and psychologically. The child sees, grandparents and so on. It sees all multiplicity of people. And we learn that we will be different as time passes. We always hear our parents speak about what we're going to do when we grow up. Or when we're older. What's that? We must know that death in the end terminates life. That time becomes serious, not frivolous. Right? Quality of life is instigated. And we see time, because we see time in negative terms, as a certainty we have no power over. And we react in certain ways to this fact. Okay. We all realize we have no power over death. And by the way, this is the reason you want. I'm just going to emphasize this. It's the reason you want to install the virtue in them. You want to